Why has a civilization once known for its scientific brilliance fallen behind? In this deep dive, we explore Zafarullah Khan's powerful call for Muslims to revive a culture of inquiry and align faith with the frontiers of science.
That's right. We're looking closely today at some key excerpts from his book, Islam in the Contemporary World, A New Narrative.
And our goal here really is to unpack Khan's perspective. We want to get a handle on how he diagnoses the current state of science and tech in Muslim-majority societies.
Yeah,
What does he see as the core problem?
exactly. And then critically, we'll explore his quite passionate appeal for reform. He wants a renewed focus on scientific inquiry. He doesn't just point fingers, he offers a way forward.
Okay, so we'll be digging into the specific data points he uses, his main arguments, and, well, the urgency behind his call to action.
It's definitely a critical issue, and Khan doesn't really pull any punches.
So let's start where Khan starts. His opening premise is, well, it's pretty stark, quite challenging, actually. He says Islam, which he sees as intended to be the last mercy of the Lord for mankind, has sadly become linked with things like exploitation, poverty, terror, homicide.
It's a tough opening line, absolutely. But it immediately sets the stage for why he feels such urgency.
Right. And from there, he draws his conclusion that Muslims are essentially stuck to the past.
That's his core diagnosis. And in his view, this stuckness prevents them from creating a truly Islamic modern existence.
Even though he believes Islam itself,
Mhm.
if properly understood in practice, could actually lead that kind of development.
Precisely. It's a potential he sees being missed.
So this idea of being stuck, for Kant, it's not just theoretical, it has real consequences. He points to a lack of real ijtihad.
That's that independent reasoning, right? Interpretation needed to apply principles to new situations.
Exactly. And he feels this lack leads to a life missing peace and prosperity, and it stops Muslims from reaching their, quote, full potential.
And it's not just an academic point for him. It's framed as an urgent, almost existential call. He says Muslims have to decide how we want to be in this world, shown through actions and deeds.
It sounds like a real plea.
It is. He urges Muslims to arise out of deep slumber and reform themselves. And there's a warning attached.
Oh.
Yeah, he says reform now or risk facing Allah's decision. And he cites the Quran here saying that decision may not be to our liking. He suggests this could mean more hardship or even being replaced by others. It's a very strong message.
Wow. Okay. Starting with that kind of weight definitely gets your attention. And to back this up, this idea of being stuck and the consequences, he then pivots to data, right?
He does. He basically says, look, the numbers on the current scientific standing, they tell the story. A pretty sobering one.
So what kind of data does he bring in?
He uses these direct global comparisons. Take universities. He notes that all 57 Muslim-majority countries combined have fewer than 600 universities.
For 1.6 billion people.
For 1.6 billion people. Then he puts that next to India, 8,407 universities.
Yeah.
Or the U.S., 5,758.
That contrast is...
Yeah, it's stark.
It really hits you. And it's not just buildings, it's the people, the scientists.
What are the numbers there?
He gives a ratio, about 530 scientists per million Muslims, which totals fewer than 300,000 scientists for that whole population.
Okay, and how does that compare?
Well, the U.S. has nearly 4,100 per million, Japan over 5,000 per million.
Again, a massive gap.
A massive gap. And it gets even clearer when he looks at, say, global recognition, like Nobel Prizes in science.
Right. I remember reading this part. It's quite striking.
Only 2 awarded to Muslims in the sciences, ever, compared to 194 awarded to Jewish scientists.
And he notes something specific about those 2 Muslim laureates, doesn't he?
He does, Ahmed Zawel and Aziz Sankar. He points out they're identified as Egyptian-American and Turkish-American, respectively. And crucially, both had settled and worked in the USA.
Which seems to underscore his point about where the infrastructure and environment for top-level science currently exists. Exactly. It feeds right into his argument about reliance on the West. He also talks about research output more generally.
Beyond just the prizes and headcounts.
Yeah. Things like scientific journals. He says there aren't that many in the Muslim world, and they're often hard to access, not indexed internationally, not online.
So sharing and building on research becomes difficult.
Very difficult. He mentions the Arab world contributes less than 0.5% of papers in the top medical journals. And he's quite blunt about the general state of labs, libraries, educational institutions. They just do not compare to those of the West.
So taking all these statistics together, the universities, the scientists, the prizes, the journals, the infrastructure, what's the bottom line consequence for Khan?
He states it plainly. If you're a Muslim wanting advanced science or tech education, you likely need to get a scholarship to a Western university.
Okay.
If you want to do cutting-edge research, you often rely on Western labs. To stay current, you read Western journals. It points to a deep dependency.
Right. So he's painted this picture of the problem using data. Now, the crucial part, why? What does he see as the root causes of this scientific decline?
Well, for Khan, a really central issue is attitude. It's about the thinking and attitude towards science itself.
How so?
He argues that Muslims today mistakenly see science as a Western discipline, something foreign.
Instead of
recognizing it as their legacy, he really emphasizes this, that Muslims historically developed, promoted, and even introduced science to the world, and somehow that heritage has been forgotten.
That's a powerful reframing, seeing it not as external but internal, part of their own history. Where else does he find fault?
Education is a huge focus for him. He talks about an educational misdirection.
What does he mean by that?
He observes religious-minded people choosing madrasas, the traditional religious schools, over modern schools and universities. And controversially, he claims the curricula in many of these madrasas are, quote, repugnant to the explicit teachings of Islam.
Wow, that's a strong claim, implying they're not aligned with Islam's call for knowledge.
That seems to be his implication, yes. That they might be promoting a narrow view that excludes or devalues scientific knowledge, which he sees as integral to Islam.
So it's not just a resource issue, but a value issue. What kind of knowledge is prioritized? He also gets into a lot of systemic problems, right?
Oh, absolutely. He lists quite a few,
Right.
beyond the low numbers of scientists and engineers we mentioned.
Right.
He points to the lack of good scientific literature in local languages, Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Turkish, and so on.
Which makes English essential.
Critical, because something like 80% of global scientific literature is in English, and he notes that proficiency in English is often lacking.
And the quality of science education before university.
He sees that as a major weakness, too. Good primary and secondary science teaching, mostly confined to a handful of private urban schools, not widely available in state schools.
And then at the university level.
The focus tends to be on theoretical teaching rather than research, often due to a lack of labs, lack of qualified faculty, very few strong PhD programs or top-tier research centers. Universities are often overcrowded and underfunded.
It sounds like a pipeline problem, but also a problem at the destination, even if you get trained.
Right. There's what he calls an acute scarcity of career researchers, not enough mentorship. And graduates who are trained in research often end up taking bureaucratic jobs, not doing research.
So the talent doesn't stay in research.
Often not. He argues that they need research capacity across the board: universities, government, nonprofits, corporations.
He also mentioned something about technology transfer versus building local capacity.
Yes, a reliance on buying turnkey projects and paying for foreign maintenance instead of developing their own ability to adapt and innovate, what he calls adaptive research capabilities.
And international companies aren't setting up R&D there.
Not typically. He says multinationals prefer doing research back in Europe or North America and need big incentives to do joint ventures in Muslim countries. Plus, professional scientific societies, which are vital networks, are developing slowly.
Okay, and then there's the elephant in the room, funding.
Huge issue. He highlights the massive R&D spending gap. You've got countries like Japan, the US, Germany spending 2% or more of their GDP on research.
And in Muslim-majority countries.
No country spends more than 0.5%, 0.5% of their GDP. And he adds that their GDPs are generally much smaller to begin with, so the absolute investment is tiny in comparison.
That's a critical piece. He also connects this to the political climate, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that authoritarian regimes are a significant barrier. By denying freedom of inquiry and dissent, they stifle the very atmosphere needed for science to flourish.
How so?
He believes this climate cripples professional societies, intimidates universities, and limits essential contact and collaboration with the outside world.
So it's this tangled web attitude: education, funding, systems, politics.
It really is. He adds that states often view science just as a commodity to be purchased via technology transfer, which undermines building local research. There's little regional cooperation. Research isn't well institutionalized, lacking stable funding, long-term goals, autonomy.
And underlying all of this, he brings it back to a philosophical point.
Yes, that unresolved tension, as he sees it, between faith and reason. He thinks this allows what he calls Muslim obscurantists to reject science and contributes to a general public ignorance and indifference.
That's a really comprehensive and, frankly, quite harsh diagnosis he lays out. After detailing the problem so thoroughly, what's his proposed path forward? What's the vision for revival?
Well, he pivots by doubling down on a core belief. Societies need science and technology to progress and earn respect. He points straight to the West's rise after its scientific and industrial revolutions.
So S&T isn't just nice to have, it's essential for gaining, as he puts it, a respectful status globally.
Exactly, that's the motivation. And his recommendations start with that fundamental point about attitude we discussed.
Changing the mindset.
Yes, Muslims must change their thinking, he says. See science not as foreign, but as their own legacy. Reclaim it.
And connect that back to education again.
Directly, he argues scientific knowledge should be considered as vital as Islamic law or fiqh.
Really, on par with religious law.
That's his bold suggestion, which means integrating science properly into madrasa curricula, tackling that educational misdirection head-on.
So bridging the perceived gap between religious and scientific learning.
Seeing them as integrated, essential parts of a whole. He also stresses building actual excellence, top-notch educational institutions, research institutes, high-level teaching, up-to-date research.
And fostering open discussion.
Crucially, creating an atmosphere where complex scientific topics can be freely discussed. He mentions things like harnessing the universe, space exploration, atomic energy, even integrating spirit and matter within science. Big ideas.
Those are definitely ambitious.
Yeah.
How does he tie these scientific goals back to Islamic values? Does he make that link explicit?
He does, very powerfully. He emphasizes that the purpose of new discoveries should be human benefit, curing diseases, improving health, ensuring food security.
So science in service of humanity.
Exactly. He frames this not just as a good idea, but as an obligation. He even calls it humanity's debt to the Muslims, equating work for human welfare directly with the spirit of Islam.
That grounds the scientific pursuit in a moral framework. Did he suggest who should lead this change?
Yes, he makes a direct appeal to the respected ulama, the religious scholars. He asks them specifically to help cultivate a taste and culture for science and technology in the community, recognizing their influence.
And financing all this. This is where his ideas get quite specific, right?
Very specific and
Right.
perhaps controversial for some. He calls on the community, the ummah, to redirect its spending.
Away from what?
Away from what he describes as unnecessary rituals, public meetings, and rallies, which he believes have no relevance to the true spirit of Islam.
And
Towards promoting science and technology. He wants that money invested in education and research. And he gives concrete examples of this reallocation.
He certainly does. He suggests the ulama could issue a fatwa, a religious ruling, saying it's better to use money planned for certain ceremonies to pay a poor science student's tuition fee instead.
That's quite direct.
And he goes further. He suggests that instead of performing a second Hajj or Umrah pilgrimage, these are the voluntary ones beyond the single required Hajj.
Okay.
An individual should consider funding an engineering student for a full year. He says he sincerely believes this would please Allah more and even ensure their first Hajj or Umrah was happily accepted.
Wow. That's a profound reframing of piety and good deeds, arguing that investing in scientific potential could be more spiritually valuable than traditional religious observances.
It absolutely challenges conventional thinking about resource allocation and what constitutes the most meritorious actions within the faith, as he sees it. So let's try to pull this all together. We've gone through his diagnosis, the data, the perceived root causes, and his proposed solutions. What's the absolute core message you take away from Zafarullah Khan's arguments here?
For me, the core is that he sees the scientific decline not just as a technical or funding issue, but as something deeply rooted in a disconnection from history, their own scientific legacy, and maybe a misunderstanding of Islam's relationship with inquiry and reason.
Right, and all those specific points, the university stats, the R&D spending, the education system issues, the political factors, even the call to redirect Hajj funds, they all serve to illustrate the scale of the problem and the radical, comprehensive changes he believes are needed.
It's about regaining not just scientific capability, but also societal vitality and global respect. And he delivers it with that clear sense of urgency, a rise out of deep slumber, and a warning about the consequences of inaction.
And for you, listening to this deep dive, understanding Khan's perspective, even if you don't agree with all of it, offers really valuable insight. It goes beyond the headlines to show the internal debates, the self-critique, the challenges, and the aspirations happening within this vast global community.
It definitely forces you to think about the complex interplay of faith, history, culture, politics, and science. It's not a simple picture.
Not at all. And it leaves you with some potent ideas to mull over. Khan's challenge about whether funding a science student could be a higher priority than certain rituals, or that fundamental quest he points to reconciling faith and reason, integrating spirit and matter in a scientific age. It really prompts you to consider what true progress means for individuals and for societies, and where we should perhaps focus our collective energy and resources for the greater good.